There is nothing which can better deserve our patronage than the promotion of science and literature. Knowledge is in every country the surest basis of public happiness. George Washington. To argue with a man who has renounced the use and authority of reason, and whose philosophy consists in holding humanity in contempt, is like administering medicine to the dead, or endeavouring to convert an atheist by scripture. Thomas Paine, in his American Crisis. They who can give up essential liberty to obtain a little temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety. Benjamin Franklin, referring to the Loyalists of the 13 colonies. The United Kingdom of Great Britain had its origins in British attempts to colonize the Western Hemisphere. It came about through the failed Darien scheme of the Scots to settle Panama in the 1690s, which eventually led to the Act of Union in 1707. Under the personal union of James VI and I from 1603 onwards, however, royal charters were granted to populate the North American continent, starting with the settlements of Jamestown and Plymouth. Britain was not great at sustaining colonies, though, and control of the New World was mostly left to Spain initially, and then France. In 1756, though, Britain decided to take its share of the pie and declared war on its colonial rivals in the conflict known as the 7 Years' War. To Americans, this is remembered as the French and Indian War, and was instrumental in developing a common identity as the 13 colonies, as the East Coast states collaborated, without the support of British, against the incursions to the west. At the beginning of the 18th century, North America was not a fundamental part of the growing British Empire. Instead, India was seen as the jewel in the crown because of its great natural wealth and taxation base. The East India Company's influence was massive, and it took de facto control of huge swathes of territory by employing local rulers and exploiting religious tensions. By the mid-18th century, however, the company was getting greedy and forced Indian farmers to grow opium instead of food crops, causing man-made famine. Once thought too big to fail, the corporation overreached itself and got into serious financial difficulty. This prompted the British government to intervene, and it passed the Tea Act in 1773, which granted the company the right to export tea to North America without tax, but which required colonials to pay an import tax, therefore helping to pay off their war debts. The taxed tea was actually cheaper than the illegally smuggled Dutch tea that was flooding the market at the time, but the principle of no taxation without representation was more important. This led Boston merchants, some of whom dressed as Native Americans, to dump an entire shipment of tea in the harbour on the 16th of December. It was the start of the 13 colonies' move towards active opposition against the British government. Political protests and boycotts soon grew into military confrontation, and by 1775 the Continental Army, led by General George Washington, were laying siege to Boston, fortifying the surrounding hills. It was at Bunker Hill that the British and Americans had their first confrontation. The British emerged victorious, but sustained 1,000 casualties. American forces did not withdraw from the city outskirts, and the Redcoats were forced to abandon Boston in the spring of 1776. They set sail for New York, the site of another battle at Long Island, which Washington lost. There was talk of burning the British-occupied predominantly Tory city to deprive the Crown of that stronghold. The Continental Army then began a long retreat south. Although the British had educated commanders, excellent discipline, and superior logistics, the Americans were able to chip away and make incremental gains in a war of attrition that concluded with the Treaty of Paris in 1783. There is a myth that the Americans used guerrilla tactics, which gave them an advantage over the British, who were constrained by fighting in strict lines. But this is not true, as most American victories were won in conventional battles. The Americans refused to capitulate, where the British refused to press their advantage multiple times when they had sufficient power to totally annihilate the rebels. American independence was too strong a motivating cause to be revoked once the Pandora's box was opened in the summer of 1776. Thomas Paine's Common Sense, addressed to the inhabitants of America, remains the best-selling book in US history relative to the contemporary population. It set forth an argument as to why they should declare independence. Paine believed that mankind could be perfected and that the ideal republic could be achieved. His radical anti-monarchist and anti-aristocratic stance was an innovation compared with a large proportion of Americans who believed that the king, George III, could veto a corrupt British Parliament. Paine was the great intellectual of the Revolution who said that government is the badge of lost innocence. Unsurprisingly, he was opposed to the Federalist, John Adams, who wanted a strong executive, or president, and remote upper and lower houses based in the capital. His legacy is not only the Republic of America, but republicanism itself. In the mid-18th century, you boasted about your aristocratic blood, and by its end, you stressed how common you were. Benjamin Franklin was born in Boston, just before the Act of Union. It was a Calvinist city that had just witnessed the Salem witch trials. A generation later, it was a thriving cosmopolitan metropolis. Franklin's autobiography is another of the most widely read texts in the US, in which he lays out how he initiated his own economic emancipation through thrift, hard work, and enterprising spirit. This is the American dream. He is also famous for capturing and storing electricity from the sky using a lightning conductor. In Britain, he met the leading lights of the Scottish Enlightenment, and he spent 2 years negotiating with Louis XVI for French intervention in the Revolutionary War, which may have tipped the balance in the Americans' favour. He is a founding father and features on the $100 bill.